So capitalism, as an economic philosophy, is an outgrowth of the Enlightenment era. But what does capitalism mean? The word comes from the Latin capitalis, meaning of the head. And the relation of this concept to the later financial connotation of the word capital is unclear. Its first use in that sense was actually the circa 1630 word capitale, meaning stock or property. The basic building unit of capitalism is the corporation, and these first started, not surprisingly, in the 1600s. The development of the corporation was spurred on by the improvement of sailing and navigation technology, and the ensuing boom of the shipping industry. This is why the root word mer, meaning sea, is at the heart of the word mercantile, and why we still say shipping when we are referring to the transport of goods, no matter the method. The improvement of seafaring led to the blossoming of a new form of economy. Now merchants could sail to India, Asia, Africa, or even the Americas, and trade an unprecedented variety of goods, with an unprecedented volume of gold and silver coin available to aid those transactions. But ships and crew were still expensive, and the voyages dangerous. If one trip went bad, an investor could find himself in debt for life, and worse, in debtor's prison. So the government of Holland, a leading power amongst the sea merchants of Europe, came up with a novel concept by which numerous merchants could pool their resources and minimize their individual investment risk. They created a corporation, a group of investors who would collectively invest in a business venture to form a company, which then became a legal person, according to a declaration in the company's charter granted by the government. This person was then able to enter into legal contracts and business ventures, just like a regular person. Only there was one important difference. Unlike a real person, the corporation could not be thrown into debtor's prison. Indeed, there was, and is still, no real way to force a corporation to pay its debts. When the corporation determines that it is no longer viable, it declares bankruptcy, and more often not, leaves those to whom it owes money holding the bag. This arrangement worked out well for the Dutch merchants of the 17th century, and soon the idea was picked up by other countries, like Britain. Thus, the formation of the famous British East India Company, as well as its rival, the Dutch East India Company, was possible. In a corporation, the total worth of the company is divided into shares, which are sold to the investors as percentages of the company's worth, slices of the pie. The more shares each investor owns, the greater his slice of the pie. The price, or value, of each share fluctuates along with the overall value of the company. Dividends from the company's profits would be paid to the investors annually in relation to the number of shares that they own. At any time, an investor may sell his shares to another investor. It did not take the Dutch merchants long to realize that these shares of a corporation could be traded almost as a form of currency, just like any fiat money. This led to the creation of the first stock exchange in Holland in the year 1631, a year after capital began being used as a financial term. Prior to the invention of corporations, the rise of capitalism was foreshadowed by a slow economic revolution that took place between the 5th and 13th centuries. This was a result of the aforementioned phenomenon of mercantilism, the trade of goods overseas via the newly developing shipping technology for the explicit purpose of turning a profit in coin, not merely to barter. This practice paved the way for capitalism, as merchants learned to buy goods in coin at one place and then sell them at a higher price somewhere else. Mercantilism originated in Rome and the Middle East and was widespread throughout the Roman Empire. Indeed, the spread of the Roman Empire and the spread of mercantile trade were really one and the same process. But when the Roman Empire fell, mercantilism fizzled. The economy of what was now Europe contracted and localized. This led to an overall decline in the use of coin for trade. As the Dark Ages took root, economics, education, health, and scientific progress came to a halt. The system of feudalism began to develop, in which only the nobility had access to, or even need of, money. Everyone else worked small farms to produce what they and their feudal lords required. Yet throughout Europe's Dark Ages, the cultures of North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even Islamic Spain continued their tradition of mercantilism and continued to trade in coin. Not only that, while the Europeans were devolving scientifically with the help of repressive Catholic Church policies, Middle Eastern cultures were developing newer, more sophisticated methods of sailing, minting coins, calculating money, and otherwise doing business. Europe would languish in its own ignorance until, in the 11th to 13th centuries, an empire of enlightened warrior priests would rediscover the secrets of the East and lead Europe out of the dark, onto the path to the Renaissance. A large part of this involved the rediscovery of the power of money. I am speaking, of course, of the Knights Templar, forefathers to the Brotherhood of Freemasons, and the inventors of modern banking. Part 2. Chapter 6. The Death of the West and the Birth of the Temple. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire mirrored the rise and fall of the Roman mercantile economy, and in fact, Rome's decline was largely caused by a decline in trade. It was the ancient Lydians who had first begun the minting of coins, but it was the enterprising Greeks who spread the trade of coins around the ancient world to all of the many nations with which they did business. The Romans, who succeeded the Greeks as the next great culture, took it even further. As the expanding empire conquered more and more foreign lands and appropriated them into their economy, they built what Jack Weatherford describes in A History of Money as the world's first empire organized around money, whereas the great Egyptian, Persian, and other traditional empires had largely rejected money in favor of government as the main organizing principle. Rome promoted the use of money and organized all of its affairs around the new commodity. But this same process would eventually become their undoing. Like the Spaniards, who would later appropriate American lands into their empire, the Romans fell into the same trap. Their conquests made them rich, but the decadent emperors rapidly spent their money importing luxury goods from these and other foreign lands. They purchased much, but they exported little, and thus Rome's wealth flowed in only one direction, out of Rome. To make matters worse, they now had a huge empire to maintain, which was expensive, and they also continued their military efforts to expand this empire, which meant hiring mercenary armies. To pay for everything, one emperor, Nero, tried to increase the amount of money available by reducing the silver and gold content of the coins and making them smaller. All this resulted in, of course, was inflation, and each of the coins was now worth less than it was before. To get more of these devalued coins into the government coffers, taxes were increased greatly, while welfare programs were devised to keep the poor from rioting. As any student of trickle-down economics will tell you, such actions stifle growth and discourage enterprise. But in the latter days of the Roman Empire, the effects of this would forever alter the very economic system with which society operated. They slouched from a relatively free society with a free market and an open class system, with class defined by monetary wealth, towards a closed, repressive, and highly stratified caste system based upon the privilege of noble birth. As John Weatherford explains, like people anywhere, once the tax burdens became too high in comparison to the benefits and services offered by the government, the Roman subjects found ways to avoid taxation. Commerce declined. People produced more of what they needed for themselves and traded less on the open market. While the poor suffered from heavy property taxes, the latifundia, the great landed estates, grew greatly, particularly those that had been granted a tax-free status. The high taxes induced more peasants to abandon their land and move to the tax-free estates, where they at least had a steady supply of food and the essential goods produced on the estate itself. In other words, society was slouching towards feudalism, which would soon become the West's new economic system. The way was further paved for a feudal state when Emperor Diocletian initiated laws forbidding farmers from selling their land and dictating that all sons had to follow in the same profession as their fathers. Thus, generations were locked into the same occupation on the same piece of land. Money all but vanished from society. The government was still minting highly devalued coins for commerce, but refused to accept them as payment for taxes. Soon there was so little money around, and what there was inspired so little confidence, that the government found it had to conscript people into slavery to complete state projects. They also persecuted Christians within their domains and appropriated what wealth they had. Things took an interesting turn with the rule of Emperor Constantine from 306 to 337. It was he who, after experiencing a religious vision, and decided to make Christianity the new religion of the state. Some cynical historians choose to say that Constantine was just an opportunist who wanted to use Christianity for his own ends, and they say that he remained an unrepentant pagan who only truly converted to Christ on his deathbed. But to be specific, the cult that Constantine remained loyal to was that of Sol Invictus, or the Invincible Sun, in which the sun was revered as a symbol of the omnipotent God. I submit to you that this does not a pagan make. At any rate, Constantine contributed much to the historical foundations of Christianity. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313, which gave Christians the right to practice their religion freely and returned their confiscated property. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea, which developed the Nicene Creed, a major basis for all mainstream Christian thought today. Because of these actions, he gained the moniker the 13th Apostle. He then proceeded to have many of the pagan temples of Rome looted for their gold and silver artifacts, which he melted down and had minted into coins. These he used to finance the building of a new Christianized capital in the east on the Black Sea, which he named after himself, Constantinople. In doing so, he diverted all future investment and trade to the new capital as well. This was the beginning of what would become known to historians as the Byzantine, not the Roman, Empire, although the people of the new Eastern Empire still called themselves Romanians at the time. Byzantium continued to flourish. But the old Roman Empire collapsed, was sacked by barbarians in 476, and thus began what was known as the Dark Ages of the West. With no real money in circulation, feudalism became the new economic system. From 476 until the emergence of the Renaissance, put by some historians at about 1350 BC, peasants worked on large manors owned by nobles, where every effort was made to keep the manor self-sufficient. On the manor, they produced their own food, clothes, and tools, and paid their taxes in these goods. Everyone lived and died on the same manor, just as their father had done before them. Reading, writing, math, and every form of learning or science virtually ceased. The only way to learn these things was to join the clergy, which is why the Catholic monastic orders became the new bastions of the intelligentsia. Because of their overall ignorance, people were reluctant to use money for trade, as most people did not know how to figure numbers at all. Learning and trade continued in the Byzantine East, but in the West, it was dead. The only people who were lending out money at all in Europe were Jews. For many years, Jews had been banned from practicing any profession other than money lending. This was not done just because Jews were good with money. The Catholic credo held the lending of money upon usury to be sinful. But since Jews were already damned to hell in the eyes of the church, they were encouraged to take on the dirty job of money lending for the rest of the community. In England, William Rufus, son of William the Conqueror, forbade Jews from converting to Christianity, which, as Paul Morrison writes in The Poetics of Fascism, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Paul de Man, would rid him of valuable property and give him only a subject. But when Jews were expelled from many communities of and on during the pogroms of the Middle Ages, sparked periodically when people began to realize how much money they owed to the Jews, these communities lost their money lenders. Luckily, however, the Holy See was inspired by God to grant the Knights Templar immunity from this anti-usury injunction. As I mentioned earlier, briefly, the Templars, or as they were officially titled, the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, were an order of crusading warrior monks thought to have been the lineal predecessors of the Order of Freemasons. Formed in the early 12th century, like many other knightly orders which formed during the Crusades, they were an elite fighting force of Catholic monks at the forefront of the European struggle to capture and control the Holy Land. But in addition to fighting, they were also in charge of fulfilling many practical roles for the community. Among them, money lending. The church allowed the Templars to charge interest on loans at an even higher rate than Jews had been allowed to. In fact, they were granted a charter that basically established the Templars as a law unto themselves, accountable to no one but the Pope. Thus, they were able to operate autonomously at their various bases throughout Europe. They even had the right to establish their own sovereign country, which is essentially what they were doing in the Holy Land when they helped to create the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Knights Templar had a very interesting entrance policy. Not only did new initiates pledge lifelong fidelity to the order, but they also took very stringent vows of celibacy, secrecy, and poverty. This last part was most interesting, for it amounted to the ultimate entrance fee. One literally handed over everything one owned to the order and vowed to remain in poverty, donating any earnings one might make after joining to the order as well. Considering that their knights were taken from the cream of European aristocracy, the younger brothers of wealthy and powerful heirs, this was quite significant. It allowed them to amass a large amount of wealth and land in a relatively quick amount of time. They then multiplied this wealth exponentially over the next several decades by investing in various business ventures. They farmed, manufactured textiles, built roads and hospitals, and engaged in all sorts of trade. They were responsible for numerous technological advances during this time, either through their own invention or through techniques that they learned through their frequent contact with Arabs, Jews, and Byzantines. Their business ventures had the effect of largely transforming Europe's economy, paving the way for the mercantilism that was emerged soon in post-Medici Italy, later giving birth to capitalism in Europe and America. The Templars' most significant contribution on this front was in the field of banking, which became their most lucrative industry. The Templars were, first and foremost, the official guardians of pilgrims en route to the Holy Land. This was supposedly the reason why the order was created in the first place. In this capacity, they devised a system to protect pilgrims from the highway robbery that often made such pilgrimages dangerous. Instead of loading themselves down with gold and provisions, which were likely to be stolen, the pilgrims would simply deposit some money in the form of gold or silver at the Templar preceptory nearest to their point of departure. From there, they would make their way to Jerusalem along a pre-selected route consisting of a series of churches and cathedrals, which were themselves associated with nearby Templar preceptories, each featuring banking services. There, the pilgrim would present the banker with a chit, a piece of paper that was encoded with ciphered information regarding the pilgrim's deposit at the originating bank. The pilgrim could then withdraw from the bank at his current location the amount of money he needed to pay for his stay at that particular stop on the route, or make donations to the various churches, and could leave the rest in his, quote, account. He could also make direct charges to the account for any goods or services which the Templars themselves were able to offer the pilgrim, which was often the case. It is thus that the word check or check entered into the English and French languages. Indeed, a great many Middle English words, especially those pertaining to banking and commerce, seem to have originated in one way or another with the Templars. In the case of check, it was related directly to the use of the checkerboard cloth which Templar merchants and bankers used to square their accounts to check their assets and liabilities. The Templars had originally picked up the use of the checker pattern from their contact with the East, from whence they also learned to play chess, and it is theorized by some authors that it was Templars who originally combined the chessboard, which was not at first checkered, with the checkerboard pattern, enhancing the deep symbolism that the game of chess already possessed. The use of the checkerboard as an abacus became widespread as mercantilism progressed, and thus the term exchequer came to mean a treasury, as of a state or nation. The term check may also be related to jeton, which is the name of the round coins that were often used as tally chips on exchequer boards, representing various denominations of money. They were introduced by the Templars in France in the mid-13th century. As the Templars expanded their banking empire, and as they came to control many other staple industries throughout Europe, they quickly became the continent's most dominant economic influence. Never before has a single institution used money alone to amass so much worldly power. This power threatened not only the monarchs of Europe, most of whom were now financially indebted to the Templars, but even Pope Clement V, who no longer was able to hold the Templars under the thrall of his signet ring. Soon the Templars would become a force that no one could stop, and they seemed to hold allegiance to no one else either. No earthly power, at least. Their enemies hypothesized that for the Templars to have become so wealthy and powerful in such a short span of time, they would have had to have made a pact with the devil. With a little investigation, it was discovered that, in fact, they had. When the Templars were arrested en masse on Friday, October 13, 1307, on charges of idol worship and heresy, there were found throughout their preceptories various human skulls and representations of human skulls or severed heads, which appeared to have been afforded certain ceremonial importance. The symbol of the skull and crossbones, apparently invented by the Knights Templar, was used everywhere throughout their possessions. Carvings depicting a grotesque goat-headed creature with a semi-human body at once both male and female were also found in the Templars' ritual chambers. In confessions painfully extracted, Many knights admitted that the skulls, the heads, and the hybrid creature all represented their secret god, Baphomet, whom they worshipped because it caused the land to germinate and also made them rich. Modern occultists, for whom Baphomet is now a potent symbol, see in this idol a representative of the universal principle, the azoth, or fifth element, which to alchemists is the key to turning lead into gold. This is probably what it meant to the Templars too, as we shall see. But to their interrogators, the tortured knights were confessing devil worship, and they were punished accordingly. The order was disbanded, the Grand Master burnt at the stake, and the offending knights sent to do penance at various monasteries. The power of the Templars was crushed. Chapter 7. The Renaissance and the Rise of the Merchant Class. After the disappearance of the Knights Templar, the tradition of mercantilism and banking continued on, conducted mainly by a group of Italian merchant families based in cities like Genoa, Pisa, Florence, Venice, and Verona. These families chose to get around the Catholic prohibition against usury by using semantics. Instead of issuing loans, they wrote out bills of exchange, specifically called cambium per lettres in Latin, meaning exchange through written documents or bills. These bills were contracts in which the bank gave the contractee an amount of money in one currency, and that person agreed to pay the bank a certain amount of money in another currency at a certain date. It just so happened that the amount of money paid back had an exchange value greater than the amount of money that had originally been issued. Thus, the Italian banks got their interest without having to call it that. The new Italian bankers brought money lending to a whole new level because they brought it to the street. The Templars had dealt exclusively with the noble class, but the Italians dealt with everybody, landlords, merchants, and vendors, with no discrimination between Catholic, Muslim, or Jew. It was around this time that the word bank actually came about, from the Italian word for table or bench. Unlike the Templars, who operated out of fortified castles, the Italian banks operated from temporary benches and tables set up at market fairs that took place in various cities throughout the year. One of the advantages of this new system was that the economy was not bound to the availability of any single currency. In the past, a shortage of one type of coin could put business to a halt. But now, if there was a shortage of one type of money, the bankers would just continue working with another type. They could also continue to write bills of exchange representing a certain currency, even if there was not much available, so long as the currency still retained the public confidence. If there were not enough coins available in the currency in which the loanee was obliged to pay the bank, he could arrange to pay them in another currency instead. Yet another advantage of this banking system was that now money was flowing much more freely in and out of bank accounts, and thus being utilized much more efficiently. Instead of vast treasure stores of money sitting stashed in a castle, it was in a bank account, allowing the bank to use it as a reserve to loan money out to merchants or to other bankers. This money would then be used by the merchant loanees to do business, stimulating the local economy, and would eventually be paid back to the bank with the equivalent of interest. Thus, each deposit into one of these banks multiplied the overall money supply of the economy exponentially, as Jack Weatherford explains. Under the new system, a bag of 100 florins, gold coins from Florence that might once have sat idle for years in a noble's strongbox, could now be deposited for safekeeping in an Italian bank that had access to branches across the continent. The bank then lent the money and circulated the bill of exchange as money. The noble still had his 100 florins, which were now on deposit in the bank. The bank had 100 florins on its books. The merchant who borrowed the florins was richer, and the person who held the bill of exchange now had 100 florins as well. Even though only 100 gold coins were involved, the miracle of banking deposits and loans had transformed them into many hundreds of florins that could be used by different individuals in different cities at the same time. This new banking money opened vast new commercial avenues for merchants, manufacturers, and investors. Everyone had more money. It was sheer magic. Of those who profited, none did more so than the banking families of Peruzzi, Bardi, and Acciaiuoli, all from Florence. Their wealth and money-lending services gained them influence with both the papacy and the monarchy of England, Edwards I, II, and III, whom they were largely responsible for financing. Because of these families, Italian currencies, especially the Florentine florin and the Venetian ducat, became the standard coins of continental Europe. The downfall of these families came when the English monarchy, then headed by Edward III, defaulted on its loans with the bankers in 1343. Soon there was no reserve cash left in the banks to cover all of the other loans that they had outstanding. The system worked great so long as all of the participants maintained their confidence in it. But now the vulnerabilities of a system built on faith were exposed, and these banking enterprises collapsed like a house of cards. An outbreak of plague in Italy from 1343 to 1348 finished them off. Luckily for Europe, though, another family was soon to take over the reins of Italian banking, a family seemingly destined for greatness. In 1360, a man named Giovanni de' Medici was born. He grew up to be a merchant and, along with two of his sons, Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Elder, created not only a powerful banking and mercantile dynasty, but a multi-generational political power as well. They became the dominant financial force in Europe. They intermarried with the royal families of the continent, and two Medici women, Marie and Catherine, became queens of France, fathering French kings as well. Meanwhile, two Medici sons, Giulio and Giovanni, became the popes Clement VIII and Leo X, respectively. Numerous Medicis held other posts of importance in the church and in government. More important, perhaps, is that the Medicis quite purposefully used their influential positions to change the world for the better, and forever. They patronized the arts and letters, science and mathematics. They paid for the establishment of schools, churches, and hospitals. Because of their financial backing, the enlightened ideas of the Renaissance took hold with artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli, writers like Dante Alighieri, and scientists like Galileo. Learning began to flourish once more, and the stranglehold that the Catholic Church had held on learning began to lift, as artists now felt more free to compose human-centered rather than purely God-centered works, even in scenes depicting religious events. Christ and the Holy Family were now portrayed as more human, more real. Indeed, most of our modern visual conceptions of the people, supernatural beings, and events described in the Bible are based on the art of the Medici-era Renaissance. So too is much of our Christian mythology. The Medici popes used the power they held to modernize and liberalize the church in a radical way. Certain ideas, such as the existence of purgatory, were even appropriated in whole from the works of Dante Alighieri. As a result of the Medicis' patronage of authors from Tuscany, their ancestral home and center of power, the Tuscan dialect of Latin became the predominant language of the Italian peninsula and later developed into modern Italian. In addition, their patronage of the study of philosophy and the sciences was equally influential. Although it would be many years before their views were widely accepted, thinkers like Galileo, whom the Medici supported, were questioning the official church version of the structure of the universe, in which, it was believed, the sun and all other heavenly luminaries revolved around the earth, the supposed center of God's creation. These new scientists and philosophers suspected that there was a whole new universe out there to be explored beyond this earth, just as there was quite a bit of earth yet left to be explored. These years were also the age of exploration, in which European royals, no doubt using money loaned to them by Medici bankers, paid daring navigators, descended from Templar families, to search for a new sea route to India, inadvertently proving radical new theories about the shape, size, and contents of planet Earth. Authors Michael Bagent and Richard Lee, in their book The Temple and the Lodge, succinctly described the monumental nature of, in particular, Cosimo de' Medici's contributions to society. In 1439, Cosimo de' Medici began sending his agents all over the world in quest of ancient manuscripts. Then, in 1444, Cosimo founded Europe's first public library, the Library of San Marco, and thus began to challenge the Church's long monopoly of learning. At Cosimo's express commission, the corpus of Platonic, Pythagorean, Gnostic, and Hermetic thought found its way into translation for the first time and became readily accessible. Cosimo also instructed the University of Florence to begin teaching Greek for the first time in Europe for some 700 years. And he undertook to create an academy of Pythagorean and Platonic studies. Cosimo's academy quickly generated a multitude of similar institutions throughout the Italian peninsula, which became bastions of Western esoteric tradition. One of the major developments to take place in Europe, starting from the time of the Templars and continuing on through the Medici years, was the widespread use of mathematics, not just by scholars or intellectuals, but by normal, everyday people for practical purposes. The revolution began with the introduction of Arabic, rather than Roman, numerals. It is the new Arabic numbers that we use now. They had actually been adapted by the Arabs from an Indian system, although some scholars say that they are ultimately Chaldean in origin. Roman numerals were notoriously difficult to calculate with, necessitating an abacus, jeton, and/or exchequer board. The existence of Arabic numerals was known in some circles but had been frowned upon, for during the era of the Crusades, nobody wanted to touch the accursed symbols of the infidels. But the Italian merchants were already dealing with Arabs and were in need of a more effective way of calculating their finances. Practicality won the day. A watershed event was the publication of Liber Abaci by Leonardo Fibonacci, famous also for the discovery of the so-called Fibonacci sequence, also called the golden mean numbers, or the phi ratio. This was the book that really introduced Arabic numerals to the West. Notably, it occurred during the height of the Knights Templars' banking operations, which undoubtedly helped to spread the use of these numbers. Overnight, merchants discovered that there was a way of calculating numbers that was conceptually simple, and that could be done on a sheet of paper rather than using some cumbersome contraption. This new system was not immediately accepted. In fact, many colleges in Europe continued to teach Roman numerals exclusively until the 1600s. But in the meantime, the merchants made use of it. They were even responsible for the development of the plus, and minus signs, which they used to mark shipments of goods that were overweight or underweight. During the Medici years, many great strides were made in Italy in the field of mathematics. An anonymous textbook from 1478 called Treviso Arithmetic, tailor-made for merchants, taught them how to multiply and divide. Nicolas Fouquet's 1484 Tripartie en la science des nombres introduced the idea of separating numerals into groups of 3, as we do now with commas, for example 100,000, to make them easier to read. He also introduced words like million and billion to replace phrases like 100,000. Luca Pacioli's 1487 treatise Summa de Arithmetica Geometria Proportioni et Proportionalita introduced double-entry bookkeeping. There were more ideas from the Arab East that got introduced into the West at this time. Algebra was developed in the 9th century by a man named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, but the word algebra entered European languages after having been lifted during the Renaissance from the title of his book, Hisab al-Jabr wa al-Muqabalah, the science of restoration and reduction. Al-Khwarizmi also introduced the idea of decimals rather than fractions, and the term used in Europe at the time for them, algorithm, a corruption of his name, Al-Khwarizmi, eventually became a more generalized term in mathematics. Mr. Al-Khwarizmi's ideas were actually introduced to the West by a Jewish scholar named Emmanuel ben Jacob Bonfils of Tarascon in the year 1350. It was only 250 to 300 years later, when the universities of Europe began to teach the new mathematics system, that people really began to understand the philosophical implications of mathematical principles. Math made philosophers realize many irrefutable truths, and taught them to look for truths that were quantifiable and unchanging, like mathematical axioms, rather than basing one's facts on faith in religious dogma. This paved the way for the revolutionary scientific discoveries of men like René Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton, thus developed the philosophy of the Enlightenment era, which held that the universe was rational and could be understood using rational means. These ideas were promoted by the influential men involved in the newly developing phenomenon of speculative Freemasonry. These men also promoted the idea of a representative government separated from the church, so that no pope and no pope's royal lackey could ever again squelch scientific progress. The need for this form of government led to the colonization of America by Sir Francis Bacon's Virginia Company, with the aim of turning this new country into the ultimate philosophic empire, where learning and discovery could thrive without interference and indeed would be encouraged. All of these amazing changes occurred in European society from the end of the Dark Ages, signaled by the accomplishments of the Knights Templar, through the Italian merchant and banking years, which ended with the collapse of the Medici Bank in 1494, following the French invasion of Florence by King Charles VIII and the expulsion of the Medicis from the city, then on through the Enlightenment era. In this series of widely diverse events, separated by space and time, we can detect a certain continuity. To understand what I mean, let us go back to the year 324, when Constantinople was founded. Chapter 8. The Empire in the East and the Church of the Holy Wisdom. When the newly converted Christian Emperor of Rome began raising funds to found his new capital in the East, Constantine made a point of using gold coins minted from the melted-down idols of Roman pagan temples to pay for the construction. It was an affront not only to the gods of Rome but to Rome itself, for in founding Constantinople the emperor was establishing a new Rome, but he really intended for it to be the recreation of another ancient city, Jerusalem. Already Constantine's mother Helena had been converted to Christianity along with him, and had become so devout that she made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in search of the grave of Christ. A lucky woman, that Helena. She just happened not only to discover Jesus' tomb, but remnants of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and numerous other holy relics. She had churches erected on the spots where she found these items. Constantine, too, erected churches, mainly the first St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the first Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople. The change of the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople had major effects on the development of the Catholic Church. Constantine's successor, Theodosius I, held an ecumenical council in 381, in which it was declared that the Bishop of Constantinople would be second in Christendom only to the Bishop of Rome. Theodosius officially banned pagan cults and began closing any pagan temples that remained. But although the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople had started out as the same church, East and West began to divide theologically and culturally until they were eventually two separate churches and two separate empires, one waning, the other rising. The Byzantine Empire lasted from 324 to 1453, and at its height included northern Italy, Macedonia, southern Spain, Turkey, Bulgaria, North Africa, and parts of Egypt. As the empire grew, the Byzantines reverted back entirely to the Greek language, and in many ways continued Greek traditions by fostering within their empire a cultural love of Greek philosophy, art, and literature. It was during the rule of Byzantine Emperor Justinian I that an unfortunate incident occurred involving Constantine's Hagia Sophia. In 532, a riot broke out in the sports stadium known as the Hippodrome, a conflict between fans of the Blue Chariot team and the Red Chariot team. It was the ancient equivalent of a soccer hooligan brawl. The melee spread throughout the city, and before long the Hagia Sophia had been completely trashed. Justinian had all the rioters in the Hippodrome massacred, and that put an end to the riot. Afterwards, he had the church rebuilt more magnificently than ever before. It immediately became the most renowned building in Christendom and remained so until St. Peter's Basilica was rebuilt to extravagance during the Medici years. As one author, Benita Goldman of Eastern Michigan University, put it in her essay, Byzantium and Her Arts, Hagia Sophia was rebuilt on a daring scale. The dome was so large, the interior so spacious, that visitors said the dome itself appeared to be resting on light or suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The example of Hagia Sophia was so profound that, as the Byzantine Empire expanded and contracted, not one corner of it did not prefer a church with a central dome. The Eastern Orthodox structures of Russia, Greece, and Bulgaria all pay homage to the Church of Holy Wisdom. Even the humblest Eastern Orthodox structure could hardly be called complete without a dome. Just as with the Greek culture and the Romans who revered it, the captors were held by their captives in thrall. The later inhabitants of Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks, even devised their imperial mosques after the example of Hagia Sophia. To finish off his creation, Justinian took precious, expensive decorations from older temples all over the empire and used them for Hagia Sophia instead. When he was done, the emperor is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone you," a reference to the opulent temple, equally encrusted with gold and jewels, which King Solomon had built in Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant. Byzantium went through a great deal of turmoil throughout the history of its empire, expanding and contracting in size as it continually fought off invasion from barbarian and Muslim hordes. Their church, now the Eastern Orthodox Church, was even influenced somewhat by Islam, in that they began to take on the ideology of iconoclasm. Islam shunned the depiction of any living form in nature as idolatry and would allow only abstract geometric art forms. In contrast, Christianity, both the Roman and the Eastern Orthodox varieties, made great use of art and architecture depicting Christ, the Holy Family, and religious themes. They did not shy away from using these depictions in their rituals either. The Eastern Orthodox Church used what they called icons, by which they specifically meant portraits of saints which one would pray to, asking the saint to intercede on one's behalf and to pass the prayer on to Jesus. Author Benita Goldman explains in further detail the role these items play in church ritual. The iconostasis, or icon wall, in a Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox church is a screen separating the faithful from the divine and mysterious rituals of the Holy Sacrament. Unlike the Catholic Church, this ritual takes place behind a wall or screen, rather than at the altar in front of the congregation. Commonly, the iconostasis is painted with the desis, literally the entreaty. This is an arrangement of the following elements: Christ enthroned centrally, flanked by St. John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. Both St. John and Mary are most frequently depicted making prayerful entreaties to the enthroned Christ. In Russia, most homes had an icon corner where the icon was placed. Icons were believed to have a miraculous power of protection over the home and its occupants. Some icons, such as the famous Virgin of Vladimir, were thought to protect the city. Often these famous icons were embellished with covers in precious metal and gems. The Virgin of Vladimir was revered enough to have several such covers, embellished through the years in silver and gold. Similar practices existed and still exist in the Catholic Church, which likewise encourages its members to pray to statues and portraits of Jesus, the Holy Family, and other saints. So when the Orthodox Church went through two waves of iconoclasm, in which the use of images was prohibited, it further drove a wedge between them and the Catholic Church. This is why, in the year 800, Pope Leo II personally crowned a new emperor of the Western Romans, Charlemagne, creating the Holy Roman Empire, which was to last in Europe for 1,000 years, subverting the power that Empress Irene of Constantinople believed she still held in the West. To do this, the Pope asserted a document called the Donation of Constantine, that he claimed had been drafted and signed by the 13th apostle himself, in which Constantine supposedly donated his imperial power to church, giving the Pope the power to crown kings. Constantine, of course, would never have signed such a thing, and the document is now universally regarded by scholars as a fraud. But it remained the basis of the Holy Roman Empire for the rest of its duration, although of course it went totally unrecognized by the now completely separate Eastern Church and Empire. The Western ruler became known as the Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, and the Eastern ruler became known as the Imperator Graecorum, Emperor of the Greeks. The schism between the churches was finalized in 1054. The Crusades of the Holy Roman Empire to capture Jerusalem had an inadvertently negative effect on Constantinople. In the year 1096, the First Crusade traveled through the city en route to the Holy Land. The Roman Catholic soldiers were feeling spiteful towards their Eastern Orthodox rivals, so they sacked the city and other nearby domains as they passed through. The same thing happened in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade, only this time they not only pillaged it, they actually set up their own Latin kingdom in the city. The Eastern Orthodox Greeks managed to take the city back in 1261, but it didn't last too much longer. However, the great Constantinople fell at last not to fellow Christians, but to the Muslim Ottoman Turks. As we all know, the city once known as Constantinople is now called Istanbul. Chapter 9. The Head of Prophecy and the Aegis of the Goat. Let us return now to the concept of the Baphomet, the idol which the Knights Templar were found guilty of worshipping, purportedly because it caused the land to germinate and made them rich. These facts, coupled with the fact that the idol was often depicted as a goat with male and female sexual organs, might cause one to think that the Templars had somehow stumbled upon and absorbed the tenets of the cult of the she-goat Amalthea. This is the creature who purportedly nursed Zeus while he was a babe in exile on the island of Crete, hiding from his father Kronos, who wished to kill him. Her name means tender, specifically referring not to the financial term but to that definition of tender as a person who attends to or takes charge of someone or something. Webster's College Dictionary, 1999. Having little thanks for the favors of Amalthea, Zeus had her slaughtered as soon as he was fully grown, and fashioned from her skin an impenetrable shield called the Aegis. The word Aegis, or Aegis, literally means goat skin. Zeus would shake this shield, emblazoned with the image of the severed head of Gorgon, in the air in order to create thunder, and thus he earned the epithet Agiachos, meaning wielder of the goat skin. Zeus used this shield when he went to battle against the Titans. He also used the cornucopia, or horn of plenty, which he made from one of Amalthea's horns, a magical object that contained an inexhaustible supply of fruits and flowers. After he had killed her and used all of her parts that he wanted, Zeus placed Amalthea amongst the stars, where she became the constellation of Capricorn. The figure of Capricorn then came to be thought of as a sea-goat, since she resided in the celestial sea of heaven. So Amalthea was venerated by some cults in much the same way that the vegetation deity known as the Green Man was in Celtic culture, as a representative of nature, of fecundity, plenteousness, and thus, by extension, wealth. Likewise, the goat god Baphomet was so literally associated with money by the Templars that they kept small statuettes of him in their money coffers. But the Baphomet is reported to have done more for the Templars besides just making them rich. He is also said to have made them wise. In fact, it has been shown that Baphomet's name literally means wisdom, according to several linguistic interpretations. I explained previously that the Templars made use of cryptograms or ciphers in the checking system that they invented. One of the ciphers that they used most often was a simple one called Atbash, in which the first letter of the alphabet is replaced with the last letter of the alphabet, then the second replaced with the second to last, etc. It has been discovered that if the letters of Baphomet are converted into Aramaic, a late Hebrew-Greek blend used in the New Testament, and then run through the Atbash cipher, you get the word Sophia, which means wisdom. Sophia was indeed the name used for the goddess of wisdom, who was often revered in Gnostic cults in New Testament times. It was believed in these cults that one could unite spiritually with Sophia by performing certain rites and meditations, thus obtaining gnosis or divine knowledge. In addition to the message rendered from the Atbash cipher, according to the 1865 tome Worship of the Generative Powers by Thomas Wright, Baphomet was sometimes referred to simply as mate by Templars, a word which in itself means wisdom. Gnosticism was widely practiced in the Roman Empire during Christ's time. One man widely believed to have been a Gnostic was John the Baptist, the prophet of the New Testament who announced the coming of Christ. John was, after his death, revered by a number of Gnostic cults. There were even, by medieval times, numerous underground Christian sects called Johannites, who believes that John was the true Messiah. Johannite cults even exist today in the form of semi-Islamic Gnostic sects found in Iraq known as, quote, Mandaeans. It has been charged that Templars followed this doctrine, and indeed, he was their patron saint, as he is now for Freemasonry. More importantly, perhaps, he is known to have been beheaded at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and his head or skull has become a central Christian icon. This brings into focus the claim of occultist Aleister Crowley that the name Baphomet, by itself, without running it through any ciphers, means Baptist of Wisdom. Given what we know of John, this could easily have been a title for the prophet himself. So can John's head be the skull that the Templars are said to have not only worshipped but talked to? Specifically, it is said to have prophesied for them. In the Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of St. James, John's severed head is referred to as the head of prophecy. Moreover, the use of a severed head or skull for divination was a common practice throughout the ancient East, and even, though secretly, in Judah and Israel during Old Testament times. Such devices were called teraphim, as defined by the online Jewish encyclopedia. The teraphim were made of the head of a man, a firstborn which, after the man had been slain, was shaved and then salted and spiced. After a gold plate on which magic words were engraved had been placed under the tongue, the mummified head was mounted on the wall. Lighted candles were placed round it. The people then prostrated themselves before it, and it spoke to them. Likewise, famous mystic H.P. Blavatsky wrote an article alleging that the practice continued on into Renaissance Europe. The article is called Animated Statues, written for her magazine, The Theosophist. In it she wrote, "Thesaurist Ugolino puts in the mouth of the sage Gamaliel, St. Paul's master or guru, the following words, which he quotes, he says, from his Capito chap. Ex enc seng vi 1. They, the possessors of such necromantic teraphim, killed a newborn baby, cut off its head, and placed under its tongue, salted and oiled, a little gold lamina in which the name of an evil spirit was perforated. Then, after suspending that head on the wall of their chamber, they lighted lamps before it, and prostrate on the ground they conversed with it." In the Middle Ages, several Roman Catholic priests are known to have resorted to this practice, among others the apostate Jacobin priest in the service of Queen Catherine of Medici, that faithful daughter of the Church of Rome and the author of the St. Bartholomew Massacre. The story is given by Jean Baudin in his famous work on sorcery, Les Démonomanies au traité des sorciers, Paris, 1587, and it is quoted in Isis Unveiled, Volume 2, page 56. Pope Sylvester II was publicly accused by Cardinal Benno of sorcery on account of his brazen oracular head. This is exactly what many scholars believe Baphomet was for the Templars, a teraph made from the head or skull of John the Baptist. It is interesting then that Ms. Blavatsky tied the Medici family to the use of teraphim, for reasons that will become clear later on in this book. The same connection was made by Freemason and Masonic expert Manly P. Hall, who wrote about the infamous oracular heads of de Medici. So how would the Templars have gotten hold of the skull of John the Baptist? Well, during their formative years, the Templars were stationed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, right there on the mountain itself. It was the fact that they were formed there at the site of what was once the great Jewish temple, which gave the order its name, the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. Since the Knights Templar are known to have explored the secret caves beneath the Temple Mount, looking for the Ark of the Covenant, some say, it is quite possible that they discovered the head of John while down there. It is also possible that they picked it up from Constantinople while they were passing through to Jerusalem for the First Crusade. While most of the soldiers were busy with more ordinary raping and pillaging, the Templars could have been on a systematic hunt for any religious relics that might have been housed there. There were, of course, many of them there. For a while, Constantinople had been the center of Christendom, and is the most likely place for Constantine to have housed some of the relics found by his mother, Helena, in her search through the Holy Land. Of course, most of the relics she found are accounted for, and were venerated in churches that she had erected in Jerusalem and also in Rome. But some ended up in Constantinople, and I think this is the likely landing place for any relics deemed too precious to put on public display. I can even see Constantine and Helena plotting to put fake relics on display in the various churches, and hiding the real ones in the original Hagia Sophia. There are indeed stories of the skull of John the Baptist having ended up there. The most widely accepted claimant to the title has long been the skull on display in Antioch. But there was another claimant that was put on display in Constantinople and was venerated by the royalty of Aquitaine, Gaul, Italy, and Spain, who all made a pilgrimage to the Byzantine capital to celebrate its translation there by Emperor Theodosius. It was said by contemporary chronicler Adamar of Shaban to have been enclosed in a stone reliquary formed in the shape of a pyramid and placed in a suburb of Constantinople called Hebdomos, where a magnificent temple was erected for it. When it was installed in its new home, fantastic powers were ascribed to the relic to cure people and to effect miracles. Besides the skull of John the Baptist, there is another candidate for the Baphomet, which is also an artifact that the Templars may have obtained from Constantinople. It was called the Mandelion. This object's official story is described in full and adequately by the website printeryhouse.org, which sells reproductions of Greek Orthodox Christian icons. This image is considered to be the oldest known icon, and also the oldest known portrait of Jesus. According to ancient legend, King Abgar of Edessa, now Urfa in Turkey, was a leper. He sent his archivist named Hanan or Ananias to Galilee with a letter to Jesus, beseeching him to come to Edessa and heal him. Hanan was a painter and had orders to make a portrait of the Lord in case he refused to come. Hanan came upon Jesus in the midst of a large crowd. He tried to make a portrait, but could not. Seeing Hanan's need, Jesus asked for some water, washed himself, and wiping his face on a linen cloth, imprinted it with his features. When Abgar beheld the cloth, his leprosy was cured, although his scars remained. After Pentecost, the Apostle Thaddeus, one of the 70, went to Edessa and completed Abgar's cure and conversion to Christianity. The image of Christ on the linen cloth was preserved for centuries in Edessa as the city's most sacred treasure. The legend and the image are referred to by many ancient writers, such as Eusebius of Caesarea, 325 AD, and Evagrius, 590 AD. In 944, the Byzantines captured the image from Edessa, which was under Muslim rule, and brought it with great ceremony to Constantinople. The event is still celebrated in the Orthodox liturgical calendar on August 16th. It remained there until the sack of that city by the Crusaders in 1204, when it disappeared. But by that time, innumerable icons had been made, preserving the sacred image to this day. The image has been referred to in many ways over the centuries. In Greek, it is called the akieropoietos, meaning not made by human hands, in keeping with its miraculous origin. It has also been called the mandylion, literally, little handkerchief. This word, having an Arabic root, was used in Byzantium only to describe this image. In iconography, there are two variants, a version with Christ's hair and beard curly and flowing, and this version with beard wet and forked. There are similarities between this object and descriptions of the object worshipped by the Templars. The most obvious is that it shows the disembodied head of a bearded man, as the head of Baphomet is said to have been. Also, if the mandylion were the mystically created imprint of a man's face, like the Shroud of Turin supposedly is a mystically created imprint of Christ's body, it might look as the shroud does, like a photonegative, and thus somewhat skull-like. If this is indeed what the Baphomet was like, one can see how it could have been reported, by knights who were exposed to it, as both a bearded head and a skull. They might have thought it looked a little bit goaty as well. But another important similarity between the Baphomet and the mandylion is its possible use for divination. The mandylion was used by the Byzantine Church as an icon, and copies of it are still used as such in the Greek Orthodox Church today. You will recall that with these icons, people believe that they can directly contact the saint or divine being depicted on them. Is it not possible that with an icon such as the mandylion, which was also a holy relic, an imprint of the Savior's own face, some people believed that it could talk back to them as well? Or especially so if the head that was actually depicted on the cloth was the head of prophecy, that of John the Baptist. In an article entitled The Templars, the Shroud, the Veil, and the Mandylion on the website templarhistory.com, Chevalier John Ritchie, a member of the Neo-Templar group, the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, suggests that the mandylion did depict the head of John the Baptist, and that it was the same as the Baphomet of the Templars. He suggests that they obtained it during the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, after which the Crusaders set up a Latin kingdom in Constantinople. As he describes it, the most likely possessors of the mandylion would appear to be the Order of the Knights Templar. They were the first troops into Constantinople in 1204. They knew of the imperial collection, and were in fact the bodyguard to Count Baldwin of Flanders, the newly crowned Latin king in Constantinople, so it would have been very easy for them to obtain the mandylion and other relics during the sacking. Ritchie also suggests that it was not unusual for Templar depictions of Baphomet to be flat wall-mounted portraits rather than standing idols. Every Templar preceptory had a copy of this head, and one of these came to light in England in 1951 during the demolition of an outhouse at Templecombe, Somerset, the site of a long-vanished Templar preceptory. This was a curious panel painting covered with dust, but clearly depicting a bearded male head of the type referred to in the confessions forced from the Knights Templar under. Today this temple comb panel hangs in the Church of St. Mary. Temple comb, its resemblance to the face on the Mandylion is unmistakable. Chapter 10. A contract with Baphomet. But how could possessing an item, such as the Mandylion, or a mummified severed head, make the Templars rich? Well, let us just suspend disbelief for a moment and swallow the Templars' own beliefs. Obviously, they believed that Baphomet could talk to them, and that Baphomet possessed, quote, divine wisdom. So right off the bat, with that belief as our basis, it is possible to contend that Baphomet taught the Templars all forms of knowledge, including the mysteries of money and wealth. It is evident that the Templars did come into possession of great sources of wisdom, which enabled them to be involved in breakthrough accomplishments of art, science, and medicine during their time. The ideas they applied to create their international banking system were sheer genius. But more than that, it is clear that the Templars afforded the image of Baphomet itself a certain ceremonial reverence, accrediting to it a certain talismanic power, which demonstrates that they believed their devotion to it and their sacrifices to it would gain them wealth in return. This is a very ancient concept, and one which I will get into in greater detail later on. It is the belief that one can contact a deity through divination and negotiate a contract with it, in which one agrees to perform certain services for the deity in exchange for blessings in return. A deity whose symbolism was associated with the very idea of a divine contract was the Persian god Mithras. He was known as the god of contracts and the inventor of the legal system. People would invoke him as a witness when drawing up a contract of any sort between two parties, and it was believed that he would punish severely all those who broke their contracts. These deals would be sealed with a handshake, which, according to mythology, was another invention of Mithras, first taught by him to mankind when he was inducting priests into his cult. In the rites of Mithras, the initiates were made to shake the hand of Mithras, usually played in the ritual by another cult member, as a seal of a pact between the inductee and his new teacher, Mithras, referred to in the ritual by the nickname the Friend. Many aspects of this ritual were absorbed into the rites of Freemasonry. The name Mithras is related to words in all ancient languages that mean to measure. These root words have resulted in modern terms like metric, method, medicine, and mathematics. This is because Mithras was also known for having taught basic math, science, and medicine to mankind in ancient times. The root word mitr has been said to actually communicate the more generalized concept of knowledge or wisdom. Indeed, according to several modern occult scholars, including author Nicholas DeVere, The Dragon Legacy USA 2004, the name Baphomet means Father Mithras, or Father of Wisdom. Mithras was a solar deity, and the cult of Sol Invictus in Rome, followed by Emperor Constantine even after his conversion to Christianity, was very much an offshoot of the cult of Mithras. It is noteworthy that the sign which Constantine saw in his divine vision was not the Christian cross, or even the equilateral cross later used by the Templars, but actually the Chi Rho symbol, made from the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Or at least, that is what Christians today say its meaning and origin is. According to most scholars, it actually has a pre-Christian origin, and was used by the ancient cult of Sol Invictus. But the fact remains that, after his vision, Constantine had the symbol inscribed on the shields of his soldiers, who then went charging into battle against his rival for the throne. His army was victorious. He became the emperor, converted to Christianity, and moved the capital of his empire to a new city which he had built, Constantinople. It seems to me that the Chi Rho symbol, which looks like a modern letter P on top of a modern letter X, greatly resembles the skull and crossbones symbol of the Templars, the simple hieroglyph they used to represent Baphomet. It was also a symbol of Mithras. In a segment about the Chi Rho in the classic Masonic textbook Morals and Dogma, Albert Pike wrote that the cross, X, was the sign of the creative wisdom or Logos, the Son of God. Mithras signed his soldiers on the forehead with a cross. So let us say, for the sake of argument, that the Baphomet was a talisman of some sort that, among other things, bestowed upon its possessor wisdom and riches, or more specifically, the power to both gain and create wealth. Let us say that Constantine somehow came into possession of it, perhaps when his mother Helena was in Jerusalem digging around for holy relics. His religious vision may have foreshadowed this discovery, or even led him and his mother to it. Or it might have just been a story made up after the fact. It is also possible that it was already there in Rome in some hidden vault known only to the emperor, and Constantine only learned of it after he ascended to the throne. The Romans, of course, had taken over the land of Judah and had sacked Jerusalem, carrying off all of the treasures of the temple that they found. If this was the case, Helena's treasure hunt in Jerusalem could have been simply to find more artifacts. At any rate, as my hypothesis goes, Constantine used the power of this talisman to create his new empire in Constantinople. In this proposed version of events, he would have formed a, quote, divine contract with the deity represented by the talisman, just as the Templars would have later done with Baphomet. He created a temple to house this relic, the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia, or Church of the Holy Wisdom, or in other words, the Church of Baphomet. Constantine then sacrificed to this idol all of the wealth from the temples of Rome's pagan gods. That is, he sacrificed everything dedicated to the old religion, the old divine contracts, and put them in the service of his new religion, his new divine contract with Baphomet. In exchange, Byzantium became the global center of wisdom and learning, and the most beautiful, most wealthy city in the whole world. It was an empire that lasted over 1,100 years. It was only when Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1452 that the European Renaissance is said to have fully kicked into high gear, when all of the Jewish and Greek Orthodox scholars who had been living there fled the Muslim terror and sought relative safety in Europe. So let us then say that the Templars took control of this artifact in turn. This could have happened in their first pass through the city in 1090, when they and other crusaders sacked it on their way to the First Crusades. It was only after this, after capturing Jerusalem and becoming stationed on the Temple Mount, that they formally organized themselves into an order. Then they started digging for buried treasure there, just as Constantine's mother had done after, in my proposed scenario, Constantine came into the possession of Baphomet. Perhaps Baphomet operates better as a talisman and divination device when it is used in conjunction with other holy relics. Perhaps that explains why the Templars were eager to get the Mandylion, which could have been a copy of the Baphomet head rather than the original. After coming to possess the Baphomet, I think the knights probably formed a pact with the deity connected to it. They began to structure their order into an international system for advancing learning and science, and for creating wealth, exactly as Constantine had done by creating the Byzantine Empire. Their wealth and membership expanded exponentially after they created a formal constitution for their order, which I hypothesize was an extension of their pact with Baphomet. As Michael Bagent and Richard Lee describe in their book The Temple and the Lodge, until 1128, the Templars were said to have consisted only of 9 knights. Then, at the Council of Troy, conducted under the auspices of Saint Bernard, the Templars were given a monastic rule, the equivalent, so to speak, of a constitution, and were thereby formally established. From 1128 on, the order expanded at an extraordinary pace, receiving not just a massive influx of recruits, but also immense donations of both money and property. Within a year, they owned lands in France, England, Scotland, Spain. Within a year, they owned lands in France, England, Scotland, Spain, and Portugal. Within a decade, their possessions would extend to Italy, Austria, Germany, Hungary, and Constantinople. In 1131, the King of Aragon bequeathed to them a third of his domains. By the mid-12th century, the temple had already begun to establish itself as the single most wealthy and powerful institution in Christendom, with the sole exception of the papacy. If the Templars did possess this Baphomet, capable of bestowing wisdom and wealth, this may explain what both King Philippe IV and Pope Clement V were itching to take from the Templars when they engineered their arrest, even if they did not fully understand what it was they were looking for. It is said that Philippe's seneschals searched frantically all throughout the Templar properties in France, seeking their fabled treasure, for he knew they were rich. But he did not really understand that their wealth was created by banking and was spread throughout their domains, invested in various money-making enterprises. Only a fraction of it actually existed in reserve as physical currency. Alan Butler and Stephen Defoe described the situation in their book The Warriors and the Bankers, a history of the Knights Templar from 1307 to the present. Templar treasuries there may have been, and their accumulated values must have been incredible, but it would have been economic and political suicide to keep one vast depository. It should also be mentioned that much of the Templars' wealth was constantly moving about and was being used to make more money, thickening out the services on offer and expanding the business empire. The Templars owned vast areas of land in almost every Western European country, the accumulated revenues of which went to finance bigger and better ventures, all run by a staff who were not paid in the general sense of the word, but whose efficiency was legendary. It is a fact of history that neither Philip IV or anyone else ever found the Templar treasure that was said to exist, though this may, in part, be due to the same sort of careful pre-planning that ensured the survival of the majority of Templar personnel, just as surely as de Molay could take care of the brothers and servants of his order. So he must surely have ensured that movable wealth, in the form of treasure and objects, was spirited away to locations beyond the jurisdiction of the French crown. Unfortunately, the Templars' greatest asset, farmland, could not be moved, and this form of treasure ultimately did fall to either the Knights Hospitaller or, in many cases, to the monarchs of Europe. It is likely a great deal of their wealth passed to organizations which took their place, such as the Knights of Christ in Portugal. After the Templars were disbanded, many of them were sentenced to penance in monasteries, and thus they ended up joining these other knightly orders, including the Knights of Christ, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights. Despite the wishes of King Philippe to claim everything for himself, Pope Clement V stepped in and had most of the Templars' properties transferred to these other orders, especially the Knights Hospitaller. It is the Hospitallers who I believe most likely inherited the Baphomet, or at least the secrets of wealth creation which it had imparted to the Knights Templar. The Hospitallers were a rival order during the Templars' time, especially known, as the name implies, for setting up hospitals throughout Europe. These hospitals operated with what was, at the time, cutting-edge medical technology. Like the Templars, their patron saint was John the Baptist. Their full name was actually the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, but it was later changed to just the Knights of St. John. They eventually changed their name again to the one we know them as today, the Knights of Malta. In their book, The Messianic Legacy, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln described the origins of this group. The Order of St. John originated with a hospital dedicated to St. John in Jerusalem and established around 1070, some 30 years before the First Crusade, by Italian merchants to minister to pilgrims. By 1126, the Knights of St. John had begun to assume an increasingly military character which was soon to eclipse, though not altogether supplant, their hospitaller services. In the years that followed, they came to comprise, along with the Templars and subsequently the Teutonic Knights, the major military and financial power in the Holy Land, and one of the major such powers in all Christendom. Like the Templars, they became immensely wealthy. The Hospitallers began to increase their membership and take on a more military character in 1126, just 2 years before the Templars began their own first major expansion of manpower and landholdings. However, the true heyday of the Hospitallers seems to have come after the fall of the Templars in 1307. Just 2 years later, in 1309, they moved their headquarters to the island of Rhodes, which, according to the Messianic Legacy, they, quote, governed as their private principality. After 3 sieges by the Turks, they moved to another island, Malta, in 1530. By the 1600s, the order's significance had waned according to Bagent, 8 al. They write, by the 17th century, the knights still resident on Malta had been left behind by the tide of history, a staunch Catholic enclave still adhering to obsolete chivalric tenets, while the rest of Europe moved into a new age of mercantilism and middle-class hegemony. Nevertheless, they continued to operate in Malta until Napoleon invaded the island in 1798. They re-established themselves in Rome in 1834, and strangely, only then did they change their name to Order of Malta, to distinguish themselves from other Protestant orders of St. John that had cropped up since their initial inception. Here in Rome, they settled into a role which they continue to this day. They act as an unofficial intelligence service for the Vatican. They also possess a, quote, sovereignty granted by the Church, which operates in much the same way that the Knights Templars similarly granted sovereignty once did. And although the Church no longer holds the sway it used to over the governments of the world, these states still recognize the sovereignty of the Knights of Malta. Bagent et al. Describe in the Messianic Legacy the role that the Knights now play in international affairs. In international law, the current status of the Knights of Malta is that of an independent sovereign principality. The Grand Master is recognized as a head of state with a secular rank equivalent to a prince and an ecclesiastical rank equivalent to a cardinal. The order maintains formal diplomatic relations with a number of countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, and in those countries its ministers enjoy standard diplomatic privileges. The upper grades of the order are still fastidiously aristocratic. The highest knights must be able to display a coat of arms dating back at least 300 years, in unbroken succession from father to son. The 20th century Order of Malta is, needless to say, ideally placed for intelligence work. Its network of membership is international and, at the same time, well organized. Its hospital and medical services often place it strategically at points of crisis. Its membership extends from medical staff and ambulance drivers to important figures in politics, business, and finance who have access to spheres that ordinary priests would not. In consequence, the Knights of Malta became closely associated with the Vatican's own intelligence department. The book then goes on to describe how the Knights of Malta liaised for decades with the CIA and European intelligence organizations, as well as other Catholic and right-wing political groups during the latter half of the 20th century. They worked together to fund and organize an anti-communist United Europe movement, which has now succeeded in creating the European Union, as well as anti-communist movements in Latin America. It is also known that many of these knights work for banks and financial institutions that handle the Vatican's accounts. So could there be a relationship between the Italian merchant families that set up the Knights of St. John and the Italian merchant families that came to dominate international finance during the post-Templar Renaissance era? Moreover, is not it likely that the secret contingent of Knights Templar, those who may have smuggled the Baphomet head to safety when the Templars were disbanded, also continued the Baphometic tradition of finance by sharing the secrets of wealth creation with these families? Like all chivalric knightly orders, both the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. John were strictly aristocratic organizations, meant only for those of noble birth. Of course, all noble families were genetically connected one way or another through common ancestry because of the aristocratic tradition of marrying close to one's own gene pool. So a relationship between Templar and Hospitaller families, and thus by extension Italian merchant families, is implicit. It may be significant, then, that the Florentine florin, which became one of the two standard currencies of Europe during the years of Italian mercantilism, bore the image of John the Baptist on its face. With the Medici family, these possible relationships with Hospitaller families seem even more obvious. For one thing, the name Medici itself implies ancestry from someone in the medical profession. For another, the Medici's own family legend boasts of their descent from a mysterious knight of some unnamed order, as Jack Weatherford explains in A History of Money. After coming to great power, the family claimed descent from a knight Averato, who reputedly came to Italy on a pilgrimage to Rome but stopped in Tuscany long enough to slay a giant who had been terrorizing the peasants. The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne then supposedly awarded the brave knight a coat of arms bearing 3 red circles, representing the dents made in his shield by the giant. Some sources outside the family, however, claim that the 3 circles represent the 3 balls that have traditionally been the sign of the pawnbroker. Others say they represent 3 coins. The name Medici indicates descent from someone in the medical or pharmaceutical field, professions that were about equal in prestige to pawnbroking or barbering at that time. The 3 circles on the family's coat of arms may therefore represent pills, or the cupping glasses that doctors heated and applied to a patient's flesh in order to draw the bad blood up to the skin's surface. The Medicis were also connected to the royal and noble families ancestrally associated with the Knights Templar. You will recall how I mentioned in a previous chapter that the Duke René d'Anjou had once employed both Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci thus linking him inextricably to the movement to explore America. René d'Anjou was a descendant of Templar families as well, and is even believed to have been the Grand Master of a Templar splinter group called the Priory of Sion. In addition, René d'Anjou was connected to Cosimo de' Medici, and was, like him, a pivotal figure in spreading the enlightened ideas of the Renaissance. Indeed, according to some authors, René d'Anjou may have been responsible for persuading Cosimo to undertake a lot of his influential activities. Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln laid out this hypothesis in their bestseller, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It would not be inaccurate to regard René d'Anjou as a major impetus behind the phenomenon now called the Renaissance. Owing to his numerous Italian possessions, he spent some years in Italy, and through his intimate friendship with the ruling Sforza family of Milan, established contact with the Medicis of Florence. There is good reason to believe that it was largely René's influence that prompted Cosimo de' Medici to embark on a series of ambitious projects destined to transform Western civilization. Furthermore, this group, the Priory of Sion, is believed to have actually been in the possession of the head of Baphomet, which, according to the Priory's own documents, was given to them by the Templars in 1307, the year the Templars were disbanded. The head was referred to in the documents as the Caput 58M, caput being Latin for head, with the M written like the astrological symbol for Virgo, which looks very M-like. 1 year earlier, in 1306, the Priory of Sion had adopted the subtitle Ormus. For their insignia, they chose the M-shaped Virgo symbol, inside of which they placed the other 4 letters of their new name, O, R, U, and S. This name, Ormus, is very significant. For one thing, it was the name of a famous Egyptian alchemist from AD 46. It also stems from the name used for God in the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, and for the wisdom principle in some Gnostic cults, Ormuzd. It further contains the root word or, which means gold in most European languages. All of this tends to indicate that the Priory of Sion anticipated receiving the Baphomet head and believed that from it they would soon gain the ability to perform the alchemical task of turning dross into gold. At the same time, the old medieval Masonic guilds, which once revolved around the actual construction of buildings, now became based upon abstract ideas of philosophy. Thus was born speculative Freemasonry, with the help of Templar-descended families, who essentially turned this organization into a continuation of the Order of the Temple. Freemasonry, as we know, was perhaps the dominant influence on world events during the 1700s, as proto-Masonic/Neo-Templar groups were during the 1500s and 1600s. As I explained previously, the early proto-Masonic occult circles of England came to be led, in the 1600s, by a visionary named Sir Francis Bacon. He was one of the founders of the Virginia Company, which first colonized the east coast of North America for England. He also wrote The New Atlantis, a utopian fantasy in which he spelled out his vision for America as the site of the ultimate Masonic empire, directed by a cabal of enlightened intellectuals who called themselves, collectively, Solomon's House. Francis Bacon and his friends were responsible for laying the groundwork for what was destined to happen in America in 1776, and any secrets which the Templars might have possessed about statecraft or economics may have been passed along to the founders of the U.S. via this Baconian circle, as it has been called. Indeed, many authors see the United States as an attempt by the Knights Templar to set up their own autonomous state, the ideal state, completely immune to religious and kingly authority, based upon enlightened philosophic principles, and made powerful with economics that the Templars invented, using the eternal hidden power of the universe symbolized by Baphomet. The only thing that one must bear in mind is that by the time the ideal Templar state was created, the Templars had become Freemasons. In the next section, I explain how these principles are rooted in the ancient religious traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and pagan idol worship. I argue the following: that money has always been viewed as representative of both divine and royal power, that the coining of money has always been associated with the priesthood, that the operation of the economy has always been seen as metaphysical, that the tokens of money have always been thought of as enchanted objects, and that people have often made pacts with divine or demonic powers in order to gain wealth. I also draw an interestingly link between America's wealth, King Solomon's treasure, and the famous lost treasure of the Knights Templar. I think that this was not a vast hoard of gold, but a formula for creating wealth. This formula was probably discovered by the Templars and passed on to certain Freemasons, who used it to construct the architecture of the U.S. banking system.